Adjoa was the light in her mother's life, a bright, cheerful girl with endless dreams. Her mother, Abina, worked tirelessly to provide her with love, warmth, and security. Despite their modest means, their home was filled with joy, laughter, and the unwavering bond of a mother and daughter who had only each other. But tragedy struck when Abina suddenly fell ill. The disease was ruthless, and within months, she was gone, leaving Adjoa orphaned at just 10 years old. The pain of losing her mother was unbearable, but there was hope. Her mother's sister, Auntie Akosua, stepped in to take care of her. "You are my daughter now," she assured her, wrapping Adjoa in a tight embrace. Adjoa's life changed the day she moved into Auntie Akosua's house. The grand mansion, the luxurious furniture, and the endless servants made her feel like she had stepped into a different world. But despite the comfort, something inside her remained unsettled. Auntie Akosua did her best to provide for Adjoa. She enrolled her in school, ensured she was clothed, and made sure she had everything she needed. However, life in this grand home was different. The love she had known from her mother was missing, replaced by material comfort that failed to fill the void in her heart. She often felt like an outsider, a guest rather than a daughter. And then, there was Uncle Kwaku. Uncle Kwaku, Auntie Akosua's husband, was a respected businessman in the community. He was charming, generous, and well-liked, but something about him made Adjoa uneasy. At first, it was just glances, his eyes lingering on her for too long. Then, it became small gestures, a touch that lasted longer than necessary, a comment that made her skin crawl. Adjoa told herself she was imagining things, but soon, she noticed how he always found a reason to be near her, how he seemed to study her when he thought no one was watching. Her unease grew, but she had no one to confide in. Auntie Akosua was preoccupied with her failing marriage, and the maids turned a blind eye to everything. Adjoa began to feel trapped in the very house that was supposed to be her refuge. Adjoa didn't understand the weight of the emotions building inside her, but she knew something wasn't right. She began avoiding being alone in rooms where Uncle Kwaku could enter unexpectedly. She made excuses to leave the dining table early, to spend more time at school, and to stay in the company of the maids. But he always found a way to isolate her. Auntie Akosua, once so warm, became distant, consumed by the cracks in her marriage. The house that had once felt so extravagant now felt suffocating. And worst of all, no one seemed to notice. No one saw the way Uncle Kwaku's eyes followed her, the way his presence made her heart pound with fear. And then, one night, her worst fears came true. One night, as Adjoa lay in bed, she heard a soft knock on her door. Her heart pounded. She knew who it was. She had prayed this moment would never come. Uncle Kwaku stood at the doorway, his silhouette dark against the dim hallway light. "Shoo," he whispered, stepping inside. Fear paralyzed her. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. He sat on her bed, his fingers brushing her cheek. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and in that moment, her world shattered. Uncle Kwaku took her pride away from her. She stayed in bed and cried the whole night. The next morning, when Auntie Akosua was expecting her at the breakfast table, she sent a message through the maid to her that she wasn't feeling too well. Auntie Akosua suggested taking her to the hospital, but she insisted she would be fine, and hospital wasn't really necessary. When Auntie Akosua came to her room later in the evening to check on her, she wanted to tell her everything, but the threats from Kwaku about hurting her Auntie Akosua kept playing on her mind, and she kept mute. The next day, Uncle Kwaku came home earlier than usual. When Adjoa saw her driving in, her heart jumped out of her chest, because she knew the reason he came back home that early. She stopped eating and rushed to drop the plate in the kitchen so she could run to her room. But before she could run out of the kitchen, Uncle Kwaku grabbed her from the back, pulled her underwear down, and had his way with her again. This continued for a while, and Adjoa rather became addicted to it. Many nights, Adjoa would stay up in bed waiting for him to share her bed. When Auntie Akosua travels for work, Uncle Kwaku would instruct the maids not to go anywhere around the master's bedroom and his special living room. This was so that they wouldn't interfere in his evil act. He would spend the whole day and night between the thighs of Adjoa. One day, Uncle Kwaku traveled, and as usual, Adjoa was yearning for the touch of a man. It was just a day since he was gone, but it felt like a century to her. She couldn't control the urge. She went to the security guard at the gate, gave him food and money she stole from her auntie, and lured the man to satisfy her desire. The security guard, first scared of who she was, as the niece to her boss, eventually did it when she promised him to keep mute about it. She kept the security guard as a substitute when Uncle Kweku traveled. The security guard felt unsafe when one of the maids saw him with Adjoa in the act and threatened to inform Auntie Akosua. He made a decision and stopped satisfying Adjoa's addiction. Adjoa had to find another alternative because it was impossible to go through a day without sleeping with a man. One afternoon, after school, she approached the security guard with a lot of money she stole from Auntie Akosua, but this time, he refused and turned her down. Adjoa left the house and found herself under a big bridge down their street. There were a lot of street guys who were into all kinds of vices. Adjoa was supposed to be scared by just looking at them. The scary tattoos, the deep scars, and the strong scent of drugs were supposed to deter Adjoa from venturing, but the urge gave her no boundaries. She spoke to the first guy she met, gave him money, and requested he lay with her. The guy was confused because she was too forward, but money was involved, and as a street boy, he had nothing to be scared of, so he obliged. He kept stealing her auntie's money and running to the guy under the bridge for her satisfaction. One night, as she lay in bed, her soul was saddened, and she began to cry. She wished she could control the strong, strange urge, but it was almost impossible. Uncle Kweku had turned her into something she no longer recognized. The next morning, Adjoa left. She had no plan, no destination, only the need to be free. She found herself on the streets, vulnerable and alone. The world outside was just cruel. Days passed, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. She quickly learned that the world was not kind to a girl with nowhere to go. She begged for food, but soon, she realized that begging wasn't enough. Then, something inside her shifted. The touch that once repulsed her became something she could wield as power. She would satisfy her strong desire and get paid for that. Adjoa did what she had to do to survive. She learned to charm, to manipulate, and to use her beauty as a weapon. The girl who once feared the dark now thrived in it. Men were easy to deceive. They only saw what she wanted them to see. She couldn't pass a day without sleeping with at least 3 men. She would seduce security guards for food, steal money from drunkards, and pay boys on the street to satisfy the urge that had consumed her. The addiction was her prison, a desire she could never escape. Years passed, and Adjoa built a life for herself, one where she was in control. But deep inside, she knew the scars remained. One evening, as she sat at a high-end bar, she spotted a familiar face, Uncle Kweku. The sight of him made her blood run cold. He was older, but still carried the same arrogance. He didn't recognize her at first, but when he did, his face paled. She saw fear in his eyes. Adjoa decided it was time for justice. She followed Kweku, gathering evidence, tracking his movements. She reached out to a lawyer, revealing the past she had kept buried for so long. The case against him grew stronger. One night, as he left his office, she confronted him. "You thought I'd stay silent forever," she whispered. His expression twisted with panic, but it was too late. The authorities arrived, and for the first time, Uncle Kweku had no control. The trial was brutal. Kweku had powerful connections, and he fought hard to dismiss the case. But Adjoa was no longer that scared girl. She was a woman who refused to be silenced. Witnesses came forward, and the truth unraveled. In the end, Kweku was sentenced. Justice was served, but Adjoa's scars remained. Justice had been served, but Adjoa found herself spiraling. She had built a life of power and seduction, but it felt empty. Auntie Akosua had tried to reach out, but Adjoa ignored her calls. But the nightmares wouldn't stop. She had to do something, anything, to regain control. One day, Adjoa stumbled upon a shelter for abused women. A woman named Sister Mavis approached her, offering kindness without expectation. Adjoa hesitated, but eventually attended a counseling session. For the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. Healing was not an easy journey. Adjoa still fought urges, demons that had taken root in her soul. There were nights she found herself craving the life she had left behind, the validation she had once received from men who only wanted to use her. The addiction to attention, to the brief moments of feeling wanted, still clung to her. One evening, she found herself standing outside a nightclub, staring at the flashing neon lights. The temptation to go inside, to fall back into old habits, was overwhelming. Just as she was about to step forward, she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Adjoa turned, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered. "You don't have to do it alone." For the first time, Adjoa allowed herself to lean on someone. Sister Mavis led her away, back to the shelter, back to safety. That night, Adjoa made a vow. She would fight. She would reclaim herself, no matter how hard the battle. Days turned into weeks as Adjoa slowly integrated into life at the shelter. The structured environment was foreign to her. Early morning group therapy, skill-building workshops, and quiet evenings spent reflecting. At first, she resisted, feeling as though she didn't belong. But Sister Mavis never gave up on her. One afternoon, during an art therapy session, Adjoa found herself staring at a blank canvas. "Paint what you feel," the instructor encouraged. For minutes, she hesitated, unsure of where to begin. Then, almost instinctively, she picked up a brush and started painting. The strokes were chaotic, wild, but as the image took form, she saw something she hadn't expected. Her younger self, eyes full of innocence before it was stolen from her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the depth of her pain. She had been running for so long, masking her wounds with anger and recklessness. But here, in this quiet room, with paint-stained hands, she allowed herself to feel, and it hurt. That night, Adjoa didn't sleep. She lay awake, thinking about what healing truly meant. It wasn't just about justice being served. It was about reclaiming herself, and for the first time, she felt like it was possible. One evening, Sister Mavis approached her with a letter. "It's from Auntie Akosua," she said gently. Words. Adjoa hesitated before taking it. She had spent years avoiding her aunt, blaming her for what had happened. But as she unfolded the paper, her heart clenched at the first. "My dearest Adjoa, I have never stopped loving you." Tears streamed down her face as she read. Auntie Akosua spoke of regret, of how she had been blinded by her own pain and had failed to protect her. She begged for forgiveness, not out of guilt, but because she truly wanted Adjoa back in her life. That night, Adjoa made a decision. She would go see her aunt, not to blame her, but to find closure. When she arrived at her childhood home, Auntie Akosua was waiting on the porch, eyes filled with unshed tears. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. Then, without a word, Adjoa stepped forward, and her aunt wrapped her in a tight embrace. The healing had begun. For the first time, Adjoa felt like healing was possible. Staying with Akosua was harder than she had expected. She was no longer the innocent girl who once lived under this roof. She was a woman who had seen too much, endured too much. Every corner of the house reminded her of the past, of the nightmare she had once lived in. Akosua, however, was patient. She encouraged Adjoa to speak to a therapist, to start unpacking the trauma that had dictated her life for so long. At first, she resisted. She didn't want to relive those moments, didn't want to give them more power than they had already taken. But something inside her told her she couldn't keep running forever. The therapy sessions were brutal. She confronted memories she had buried, acknowledged pain she had ignored. Some days, she wanted to give up. Other days, she felt a tiny flicker of hope. It was a slow, painful process, but for the first time in a long while, Adjoa felt like she was moving towards something better. Adjoa's journey was not just her own. It was a message to the world. She had survived unimaginable darkness, but through resilience, she found light. She chose to speak out, to share her story, and to warn others. Through her testimony, many young girls found the courage to come forward, breaking the cycle of silence that had trapped them. The world needed to understand that monsters did not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they lived within homes, were familiar faces, and disguised themselves as protectors. Abina's story was a reminder of this painful truth. Innocence stolen, lives shattered. Yet, there was hope and awareness and justice. To those who prey on innocent children like Adjoa, know this: your actions destroy souls, but truth has a way of surfacing. The scars you leave behind do not fade easily, and the pain you inflict does not go unnoticed. The world is changing, and silence is no longer an option. To parents, guardians, and communities, vigilance is key. Listen to the quiet cries, notice the subtle shifts in behavior, and create safe spaces for children to speak. No child should ever bear the burden of such horrors alone. Adjoa's story is a call for justice, a demand for accountability, and a beacon of hope for those still trapped in the darkness. Because no one, especially a child, should ever have to fight such battles alone.